Hello my dear friends, this is your friend Dark Fox 3.0 and we are back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto fell in love with FEM GAARA? A love that changed everything part 2. And now let's start the fanfic. This is new. By this hour, you're usually out and about. GAARA lazily glanced to her left, where Temari lay still on her bed. It was roughly 11 o'clock at night, one day before the beginning of the final round. As the fan-wielding kunoichi had indicated, something was amiss in the hotel room. GAARA was still present, and the sun had set. Every other night, the Jinchuriki had made a point of leaving so as not to disturb her siblings with her ever-present consciousness. I lack the motivation to leave the hotel tonight. I'll do my best to be quiet, Temari, she assured her sister in a monotone voice. Temari rolled onto her side to face her sister, propping herself up on her elbow to get a better look at the younger girl who lay on her own bed nearby. Fine with me. Since you're here, would you mind telling me what exactly you do most nights? I haven't heard any reports of a growing body count, so it's not the usual thing, she asked curiously. GAARA remained silent at first, taking time to formulate a response. I've been studying my upcoming opponent, Sasuke Uchiha, she lied. Temari raised an eyebrow and rested her face in her hand. Really? I kind of doubt that. The first thing you said after we left at preliminaries was that Sasuke was boring. Besides, you have no real reason to worry about him if his match was any indication, she recalled skeptically. The redhead's left eye twitched uncomfortably at the perceptiveness of her sister. Good memory. Yes, I was being a bit dishonest. In reality, I've spent my nights simply walking. Motion quiets my mind, she replied. Much to her irritation, Temari shook her head and shifted into a cross-legged sitting position. Man, I had no idea you were such a bad liar, she said with a chuckle. GAARA scowled momentarily, but quickly regathered herself and joined her sister in sitting upright. I made a friend, or something like it, she admitted. Temari furrowed her eyebrows and leaned forward, her interest piqued. Wait, really? That's more than a little bit surprising. Not that I thought you weren't capable of it, she said. GAARA absently flicked at a strand of hair that was straying near her face. As I said, I'm not entirely sure I would even call it friendship. He has openly stated that he fears me, and acts as such most of the time. Though, he is more lenient than he could be, which is nice, she said, trailing off a bit by the end. Temari winced and scratched the back of her head. No offense, but most people are afraid of you. On a bad day, me included. You're kinda the opposite of approachable, she said, her tone nervous. The redhead sighed and stared down at her bedsheets. None taken. It's not like he has no reason to be afraid, given that he and I are bound to face one another soon. I can and will hurt him when the time comes, but for now, I just want to spend time together. As you know, such interactions are rare for me, she said dejectedly. Temari did a double take at the subdued state of her usually icy sister. You just want to spend time. This sounds harsh, but why? You've never been interested in that kind of thing before, not even with Kankuro or I most of the time, she asked. The redhead glanced up at the fan-wheeling kunoichi. Because, unlike most people, Naruto and I actually have common ground. My social skills are limited, I know that, but I actually have a foundation to build on with him, she explained. In a rare moment of girlishness, GAARA reddened at the realization that she had revealed the identity of her late-night companion. Forget you heard that, she muttered, clearly embarrassed by the slip-up. Temari gazed at her sister sympathetically. He was on the short list I had in mind. I get why you're trying to connect. He's like you, that much was obvious during the prelims. Even still, you know as well as I do what we're here to do. Getting attached is a bad idea. Trust me, I've had to have that talk with myself already, she said honestly, the image of an unmotivated Leaf Genin flashing through her mind as she spoke. GAARA pursed her lips and exhaled through her nose. Oh, I know. I'll lather myself in his blood before the sun sets tomorrow. That kill is mine and nobody else's. I'm making peace with that fact slowly, she said, a hint of a disturbing tone Temari knew all too well creeping into prominence. The elder San Kunoichi suppressed a shudder and straightened her posture again. You don't have to kill him, Gaara. You can just knock him out and hide the body so he survives. That's what I'm going to do to solve my problem, she urged her sister. Gaara shook her head and allowed her facial expression to soften. No, he's been left alone far too many times. I want to put him out of his misery. He had parents at some point, so hopefully he can meet them in the afterlife. Simply turning on him and then abandoning him is crueler than I'm willing to be with Naruto. He deserves better, she said. Tamari stared at her wide-eyed, completely shocked by the level of empathy and thinly veiled affection being exuded by her sister at the topic of Naruto Uzumaki. I can't stop you, she said sadly. The Jinchuriki nodded and laid back down on her bed, folding her hands over her stomach as she did so. No, you can't. I wouldn't even consider it if killing father was still so far beyond my capabilities. It's the only way. I don't want to kill him, but if anybody has to do it, it's going to be me. His life is in my hands, she said numbly. Finding that she had nothing more to say, Tamari sighed and slotted herself underneath her covers. I hope you change your mind, but if you don't, I'll help you recover from it. I haven't helped you enough since you were born, she said awkwardly. Gaara threw her legs over the opposite side of her bed and stretched. Don't guilt yourself. You're no different from the others. Nobody is to blame, she assured her sister, who nodded dejectedly and closed her eyes. The redhead then rummaged through her carrying case that was laying on the floor. After a few moments, she produced what she had been looking for. A white nightgown. She then changed into the nightwear and flopped back down onto her bed. Send me all the nightmares you want, Shukaku. I'm sleeping tonight, she challenged her inner demon. When she received no immediate response, Gaara let her mind begin to wander. In particular, the redhead found herself recalling the encounter she had had with Naruto on the roof on what was now their shared date of birth. At the thought, Gaara smiled softly and adjusted her nightgown. Perhaps it was selfish of me to demand such a thing, but I meant what I said. There is no other person I would be willing to share that day with. Nobody, she thought to herself as the whole scene replayed in her head. Another aspect of the meeting then came to the forefront of her mind. It was frigid that night. Likely less than 40 degrees. At least Naruto's internal body temperature is feverish, she joked mentally. The feeling of being pressed to his body quickly returned to her, causing her cheeks to grow warm. The redhead then pulled the far pillow on her bed into herself and squeezed it. Finding that it was not the same, Gaara sighed in disappointment. Irreplicable. Such bliss would be, I suppose, she thought to herself. The more and more she replayed the encounter in her mind, the more she found herself returning to the truth that she and the blonde now shared a birthday. You do not want to be sharing that with me, Gaara. Take my word for it. Gaara's face fell at the memory of the blonde's words. The statement said plenty about Naruto's rarely voiced view of himself, and it was tragic. The blonde squeezed her pillow to her chest once more. It should be the inverse, Naruto. You shouldn't be so willing to share with me, she thought to herself. A series of images then flashed through her mind, most of which involving a mutilated corpse of some kind. Gaara tightened her grip on the pillow. How little your people know, Naruto. They accuse you of being a killer, and yet you've never harmed a fly, she thought to herself, contempt for the people of Konoha bubbling up within her. Had they seen me clinging to you on the roof, they would have attacked you to save me. Idiotic fools. If anything, you need to be saved from me, she lamented silently. The redhead then rolled onto her back and stared up at the ceiling of the hotel room. How cruel you are, silent god. Does my happiness mean nothing to you? She bitterly demanded in a hushed tone. For the second time in a single month, a tear trickled down Gaara's face. Who am I kidding? There is no god. If there were, I'd have died a long time ago, she concluded depressingly. As her vision blurred from the moisture in her eyes, Gaara lifted the pillow up and stared at it, imagining her fellow Jinchuriki's face. At the thought, a ghost of a smile crept across her quivering lips. Perhaps I'll join you in the afterlife once we're finished, my sweet friend. Not that I'd expect you to be happy to see me. Naruto took a deep breath and wiped sweat from his brow as Kakashi motioned for him to finally take a rest. Once he had settled himself on the ground, Kakashi did the same. Decent work, Naruto. Sharper than ever, he complimented his student. The blonde nodded and rubbed his sore neck. The night air was cold, but body heat was at a high after having exercised so intensely. Thanks. Working with you one-on-one has been helpful. Even more than I was thinking it would be, Naruto admitted with a tired chuckle. Kakashi smiled beneath his mask and settled down completely. I'm a decent instructor when I want to be. Both you and Sasuke have seen massive growth in the last month. We'll see just how much tomorrow, he replied. The Jinchuriki fiddled around with a kunai he had plucked out of the ground. Yeah, true. Hell, I might even end up fighting Sasuke himself. You wouldn't be allowed to coach during that match, he pointed out. The silver-haired ninja shrugged and took in the midnight oxygen. I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea of watching the two of you eat each other senseless as an unbiased third party. No issues there. The problem is going to be getting to that fight in the first place. Neither one of you drew an easy opponent, especially not Sasuke, he said. Naruto pursed his lips at the indirect reference to Gaara. Absolutely. I think I can beat Neji without much of a struggle, but who knows? Maybe he'll kick my little before I break him. As for Sasuke, I don't even know if I'm picking him to win that fight, he said honestly. Kakashi sighed and nodded once again. I'm much more confident in your chances against Neji than I am in Sasuke's against Gaara. Neji is sharper than Gaara, but he's weaker by orders of magnitude from what I can tell, he pondered. Naruto frowned at one particular detail of the statement. I don't think she's that much stronger than Neji. A little bit, sure. A lot. I don't buy it, he questioned. Kakashi raised an eyebrow and gave his pupil a strange look. Given how much you've been exposed to her and the chakra she exudes, I'd have thought that you'd be more convinced than I am, he said. Naruto flinched a bit. So you know about all of that? He asked quietly. The copy ninja gave a gesture of confirmation and continued to his weary genin. I've seen almost all of it. There are some things I don't quite understand, but I get the gist of what's going on. The point is, she's a hell of a lot stronger than the fight with Lee made her seem. With those gates open, Lee briefly began to rival me in terms of raw power. The fact that she survived and overwhelmed him is an unbelievable feat. Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure she was trying all that hard, he explained. Naruto drummed his fingers on the ground pensively. She definitely didn't seem to be taking him all that seriously. Most of that fight was Gaara screwing around and moaning about how much she loved blood and all that. It's totally possible that she held back to draw it out, he said thoughtfully. A silence then overtook the teacher and student pair. After a few quiet moments, Naruto spoke once more. Do you want me to explain what's been happening at night between her and I? I've got time, he asked. Kakashi perked up at the opportunity and nodded. Please do. I'd be fascinated to hear it from your perspective, he urged the leaf genin. The Jinchuriki took a deep breath and gathered his thoughts to make his message coherent. For the most part, our little meetings have happened by accident. We both have a habit of wandering around at night for different reasons. But she did admit last time that she had come looking for me. She hasn't really tried anything weird or threatening, other than trying to use me as a heating pad. She's lonely. That's been my biggest takeaway. She's kinda like a lost puppy who likes to kill people. No real logic or reason to anything she does, just emotional drive, he began, being careful to articulate himself well in order to drive his oncoming point home effectively. The silver-haired ninja stifled a laugh. That's one of the most bipolar descriptions of a person I've ever heard, but go on, he said humorously. She doesn't even seem all that happy about the fact that she's a murderer, though she's said a few times that she doesn't regret what she's done. She also has this weird thing about me being a Jinchuriki too. She'll get all weird and touchy sometimes. She touched my face at least once, and she flat out groped me on the roof the other night. She's hard to read, honestly. One minute, she's creepy as all hell, and the next she's an awkward, girlish kitten, Naruto concluded, his tone slightly perplexed. Kakashi furrowed his eyebrows and rested his chin on his hand. Sounds like an extreme case of borderline personality disorder to me. Extreme mood swings, highly clingy, possibly even possessive behavior, and odd emotional triggers. Probably a few symptoms of bipolar in there too. You've got it rough to say the least, Naruto, he thought to himself sympathetically. I can't say I understand her any more than you do, kid. What I can say, though, is that you may want to kill any kind of empathy you have for her. You're going to end up fighting her fairly soon if things go as they seem they will. Even if she appears to have some reverence for you, she'll squash you like a fly, no questions asked. Be ready, he instructed. Naruto nodded and scratched the back of his head. Yeah, I know. It was just kinda comforting to know that somebody else was going through the same stuff as me, you know. To finally know for sure that I'm not all alone, he said dejectedly. Kakashi reached forward and put a hand on his shoulder. And your life isn't going to get any easier from here. If you get that promotion, life as a ninja is hellish, especially when you have people biased against you. I know you can get through it, you're more than tough enough, he said encouragingly. The blonde smiled and looked up from the ground. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei. I'm not gonna give up when things get difficult. I never have, and I never will. And hey, maybe I don't get promoted and life just goes on like before, he said gratefully. The Jonin nodded and stood up to his feet. You'll be just fine regardless. Well, as nice as this has been, I need to head back home to at least try for some sleep. You should do the same, he said, turning his back and walking away as he spoke. Before the blonde could reply, the silver-haired ninja disappeared into a puff of smoke, leaving Naruto to himself in the small clearing they had been occupying. Man, this whole month has been weird. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, he mused to himself. He then rose to his feet and turned towards home to begin his trek. Naruto made it home in uneventful fashion, with no encounters involving his red-headed fellow Jinchuriki. Much to his own surprise, Naruto found that he was almost disappointed. Naruto yawned as he awaited the arrival of his bowl of noodles. A month had finally passed since the preliminary round of the exams, and the final round was to begin within hours. Finding himself completely unable to sleep the night beforehand, the blonde had opted to take to the one provider of food he could rely on consistently, that being Ichiraku's ramen stand. It was the break of dawn, only a few minutes after the notoriously early opening of the stand, and the cold of the night hadn't yet left the streets of Konoha. Feels like it's been a hell of a lot longer than a month, he thought to himself as Ayame slid a bowl down the counter to him. Naruto absently caught the bowl and silently twirled his still-packaged chopsticks in his fingers. It would be less than 12 hours until he would face Neji Hyuga, prodigal child of the Hyuga branch family. While the Jinchuriki did not fear the arrogant genin, he did find himself apprehensive of the potential repercussions for losing the match. Ridicule was far from foreign to Naruto Uzumaki, but failure to follow through was. Win, lose, or draw, I'm making him taste his own blood, Naruto assured himself as he sampled his noodles. As he continued to tread through his worries and stresses, another person silently entered the stand and took a seat next to him. You look brooding. Sasuke, who had just sat down next to him, greeted bluntly. The blonde glanced at him through his peripheral and shrugged his shoulders. No, I'm just getting into the right headspace for this whole fiasco. A lot to think about, he clarified as he fiddled with his chopsticks. Sasuke nodded and ordered himself a bowl of a similar type of ramen. I understand the feeling. It could be argued that you and I drew the two most daunting opponents we possibly could have. Not that I'm complaining. It's more interesting this way, he replied. After a minute or two, Sasuke's ramen arrived. You drew the shorter straw between the two of us, I'd say. At least I've got a handle on what Neji can do. We really don't know a whole lot about Gaara's abilities, Naruto said ponderously. The Uchiha nodded in agreement and sampled his food carefully to avoid burning his tongue. Sounds like you picked up on it too. How she held back against Lee, I mean, he said through a mouthful of noodles. Naruto finished the last of his bowl and requested another before responding. I'm not even sure if she was holding back on purpose, honestly. From the sounds of it, That was the first time she'd be hit clean in a long while. I think Lee burned himself out before she got a chance to show anything other than some freakish durability, he said, seeming to be thinking aloud as he spoke. Sasuke raised an eyebrow at the specificity of the information being presented. What would you know about her combative history? He questioned, his tone still nonchalant despite the harshness of his wording. Finding himself surprisingly able to keep calm, Naruto shrugged once again. Just look at the way she reacted to Lee cracking her on the chin. She stumbled back like she'd never even been punched before. It was pretty obvious to me that she isn't used to being pushed, he said. His teammate eyed him for a moment, but chose to accept the explanation. He then shifted the topic. I'm assuming you've got a plan for how to approach Neji, he said, clearly making a silent request to know the details of the plan he had referenced. Naruto easily detected the unspoken question. Yeah, I do. His match with Hinata was great for study, because it showcased most of what he likes to do, and a little of what he's bad at too, he said vaguely. Sasuke frowned and set his chopsticks down. He beat Hinata senseless. I didn't see much weakness from him, honestly, he said skeptically. Naruto sipped from his yet untouched glass of water. That's what I thought at first, but then I went back and replayed the fight in my head. Every time Hinata managed to get him moving backwards and force the issue, she had success. The difference in power was just way too much for her. She was never winning that fight, sad as that is, he said thoughtfully. The Uchiha considered the analysis. So, what you're saying is that Neji isn't comfortable moving backwards, even against somebody as comparatively weak as Hinata? He inquired. Naruto nodded. More than being pushed back, he doesn't like being forced into longer exchanges. Hinata got clobbered for it in the end, but she figured that out about halfway through. She started forcing him to fire back more than he wanted to, which gave her chances to counter. If she were stronger, she may have been able to claw her way to a win that way, he continued. Sasuke stared at him for a few moments, his eyes a bit wide with surprise. Wow, you've really thought a lot about this, haven't you? He said with a chuckle. The blonde finished his water and set the cup aside. What do you think I've been doing all month? Neji's all I've thought about for the most part. What about you? What's your read on GAARA? He asked. Sasuke shifted in his seat a bit. She's a whole lot less complicated than Neji is on the surface, but the problem still remains that we know virtually nothing about what she can and can't do under pressure. Based on what we do know, Lee laid out a good blueprint for how to beat her. You have to collapse range, stab her with a shot, and then move. Rinse, repeat, victory, he explained. Naruto frowned. You still have to finish her to win. Lee hit her with just about the hardest punch ever thrown, and she got up like it was nothing. Just playing an in-and-out game feels pointless, he said. The Uchiha smirked. Don't you worry about that, Naruto. I've got a way to do it. I think you'll be surprised when you see it, he said confidently. Naruto grinned. Oh yeah, I'll be on the edge of my seat, he said. The boys then lapsed into silence as the sun began to rise definitively. After around 5 minutes of quiet, Sasuke broke the veil. GAARA actually came and confronted Kakashi-sensei and I at one point a few weeks ago, he said absently. Naruto tensed momentarily, but forced himself to calm. What? Did she want? He asked. His teammate studied the counter they were sitting at for a few seconds before turning his gaze to Naruto. Oddly enough, she wanted to know where you were. She showed up, interrupted our session, and just asked us flat out. It was weird, he said. The Jinchuriki considered various possibilities as he processed. Did you tell her? He asked in response. Sasuke shook his head firmly and laid money down on the counter to pay for his meal. Hell no. She was probably just trying to find you to squeeze information out of you about me. Besides, it was your birthday, and, well, we both know why you like to be left alone on that day, he said a tad awkwardly. Naruto fought the urge to shudder as pieces fell into place regarding the strange night on the roof he and GAARA had spent together. Maybe that's why she showed up so late at night. It took her that long to find me. I was hiding my chakra, so that would make sense, he thought to himself. Thanks for keeping quiet about that. And hey, if she had found me, I wouldn't have told her a thing, he assured the Uchiha. Sasuke gave a rare laugh and stood up to leave the ramen stand. Well, I guess you know what's good for you then, he said as he waved a farewell for the time being. Naruto watched him leave silently. See you around, he muttered long after his teammate had left. He then followed his example and paid for his food before exiting the stand. Moving pieces, I guess. Gaara tapped her foot impatiently as she sat alone in the entry hall of the stadium in which she would soon be competing in. The time read 7:45 in the morning, and she was as of yet the only participant to have arrived in the building. Despite not particularly wanting to participate, she knew she had little choice in what was to come. I would rather this be over quickly. I don't want to think about it, she thought to herself. The silence that permeated the hall she was sitting in was quite unusual when put into context. The stadium was far from small, and it wasn't so early that people weren't out and about. The matches were set to begin at 9:30, and nobody had arrived as of yet. This fact did not go unnoticed by the Jinchuriki, who pondered the miniature mystery silently to divert her mind from darker places. For nearly 5 minutes, the peaceful lack of sound dragged on. Once that stretch of time had passed, footsteps became audible to Gaara for the first time since her arrival 1 hour previously. The footsteps were somewhat odd in pattern, almost staggered in nature. The out-of-the-ordinary noise drew Gaara's eyes away from the floor and to her left, the direction from which the echoes were emanating. Standing a few feet inside the entrance was a shinobi in crutches. It took little time for the redhead to identify him. Perhaps I've lost my touch, she said just loud enough for Rock Lee, who had hobbled his way within earshot, to hear. The Leaf Genin remained silent and made his way over to a bench on the opposite wall of the corridor. Once he was situated, he turned his attention to his former opponent. I wouldn't say that. Given just a few more seconds, you would have killed me. Not that such a thing is commendable, he said calmly. Gaara stared at him intently. What are you doing here? She asked. Lee shrugged and leaned his crutches against the wall to his left. Simply waiting for the bystanders' seats to open up. I have 10 more minutes to wait, so I may as well remain here and be the first one inside, he explained. The redhead nodded and leaned back in her seat a bit. Front row seats may not be the best idea for a person in your condition. Things may get a bit messy, she said bluntly. The Leaf Genin shook his head. I don't care. I'd rather be up front to cheer on my comrades, even if I get a bit dirty, he said firmly. Gaara suppressed a chuckle at his literal interpretation of her words. If you wish to take it that way, then go right ahead. I'll let the rest be a surprise, she said in a half mutter. Lee was able to hear her words, but opted not to acknowledge them for the sake of saving his mental energy. When Lee didn't respond, Gaara opted to speak more. Tell me, why did you choose to continue fighting against me during our match? It should have been abundantly clear to you nearly immediately that you had no avenue by which to win, she asked. The Leaf Genin scowled. I would rather be crippled than give up before I've given my best effort. Besides, I came within inches of defeating you. I had avenues. I simply wasn't good enough on the day to finish the job, he said, seemingly offended by the notion of surrender. The redhead snorted. The only thing you came within inches of is actually making me sweat. My life was never in jeopardy. That aside, giving your best effort is likely going to get you killed at some point. We both know you'd be dead if I had been given the choice to make the result of our match definitive. It's a foolish way to think, she said. Lee cracked his stiff neck. Not surprising that you think that way. You're preternaturally gifted in a way that has stunted your ability to actually work hard. Maybe I didn't draw out the limits of your strength, but I'm entirely confident that you'll break when the day arrives on which you're pushed to those limits, and that strength isn't enough. You won't have any will to fight, he said bluntly. Gaara cracked an unexpected smile despite the near insult. Is that the real reason you're here for the front row? To potentially see me lose, up close and personal? She asked. Lee remained silent for a moment. Partly, yes. To be frank, I don't care regardless. Your first match would do nothing to uproot the arrogance of a genius. Sasuke Uchiha is no different. I may even root for you to win, he replied. Gaara raised an eyebrow. To ensure that I cross paths with Naruto, correct? She inquired. The Leaf Genin nodded, his expression a touch conflicted. That scenario would require my teammate to be defeated, but I can't help but feel that this is all too perfectly set up for the potential of a match between yourself and Naruto to not be enticing to me, he said. The Jinchuriki brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Hard work versus talent isn't as cut and dry as you'd like it to be. Naruto and I fighting one another will do nothing to advance your narrative even if he found a way to win. He's cut from the same cloth as me, actually, she said vaguely. Lee frowned. In what way? Personality-wise, there are no parallels between you, and your abilities are vastly different. Naruto has also clawed his way to success in a way you clearly haven't had to, he asked skeptically. Gaara opened her mouth to reply, but stopped when the distant chatter of voices caught her attention. A quick glance at the entrance confirmed the oncoming approach of the other finalists towards the stadium. The redhead stood up and stretched, casting a backwards glance at Lee as she prepared to join her fellow competitors. I guess you'll just have to wait and see. Genma surveyed the room around him, carefully counting the number of genin several times as he dragged his eyes across the small group. Once he had completed his mental checklist, the proctor nodded and cleared his throat to silence the light murmuring that was echoing in the enclosed space. Once all eyes were fixated on him, Genma began to speak. Looks like you all made it here on time. That's a better start than we had last year, but that's a whole nother story. Now, onto why you're here so early, he began. His words drew a chuckle from several of the young ninja, but their attention remained present. We're going to cover a few different things about how this final round is going to work, starting with the rules. No outside help is permitted, and any evidence of such will result in disqualification. You can only win by finish, murder included, and draws are only possible via a double knockout. There is no time limit to these matches, so you'd be wise to find ways to win sooner rather than later, he explained. The group gave a collective nod to confirm their understanding of the information being presented to them. Alright, now let's talk about scheduling. The first match is set to begin at 10:30 this morning, and that'll be between Shikamaru Nara and Tamari. You'll be expected to be ready to make the walkout into the arena 10 minutes before your scheduled time, and you're free to do as you please until then. After their fight is done, Naruto Uzumaki and Neji Hyuga will compete. After that, Sasuke Uchiha and Gaara, and finally, Kankuro and Dosu Kinyuda. Time between matches will vary, but all of you will be afforded a minimum of 30 minutes of preparation during intermissions. Are we clear? He concluded. Another nod was elicited from the group. The proctor then sighed. This next part is a little weird, but bear with me. Since there is a possibility of death, I need to interview you all individually to clear some things up about post-mortem. Where you want your stuff to go, the distribution of your earnings, that kind of thing. All hypothetical, of course, he said a bit uncomfortably. Tamari raised her hand, prompting Genma to nod in her direction. Wouldn't that only apply to ninja who live in Konoha? She asked. The proctor shook his head and sighed again. I'm just the middleman. What you tell me during the interview gets passed on to your superiors to be carried out accordingly. Your sensei is already aware of this arrangement, he clarified. The fan wielder nodded and lowered her hand. When no other questions were asked, the proctor pointed to Naruto. Alright, since we're all clear on that, I'd like everybody but Naruto to step out of the room for a few minutes. He'll be interviewed first, he ordered. The genin quickly drained out of the small space and into the outside hall. Once they were gone, Naruto stepped out of the corner he had been standing in and sat down on a nearby box that was closer to the center of the room. Let's get this over with quickly. This feels really dumb, he said impatiently. The proctor scratched the back of his head and leaned back against the wall. Preaching to the choir there, kid. Your interview should be the quickest, save for that redhead. I only have 3 questions for you, I think, he said. The blonde nodded and motioned for him to ask them. First off, where do you want your money to go in the event that you're killed? Your current bank balance is 54,348 ryo, he asked. Naruto's response was instant and without thought. The local orphanage. Give it to them for a renovation or something. They need it, he said. Genma smiled and gave him a nod. I'll pass that on. Hopefully, we won't come to that, though. Second question, where do you want your possessions to go? He asked. The blonde thought for a few moments before shrugging. I don't know, you can throw it all away for all I care. Most of it is junk anyway, he said. The proctor nodded and made a mental note. He then winced internally as he recalled the final question he would be asking. This next one is the last, but it's an odd one in your case. You don't have an extant clan burial site, so I need to know where you'd like to be buried if you die, he explained. Naruto drummed his fingers on his knee pensively. Well, I guess you could just cremate me or something, he said matter-of-factly. Genma felt a pang of sympathy for the boy, but nodded once again. Alright, that'd work. That's all I have for you. Go and get warmed up, he said. The blonde stood up from his box and turned towards the door. Just before he could open it, however, Genma called out to him. I probably shouldn't say this, but could you do me a favor and at least give Neji a black eye? I haven't interviewed him yet, but it won't be fun. That much I know, he requested. Naruto grinned and gave him a thumbs up. Already planning on it. Irritated murmur rippled through the recently formed audience. It was 10:35, and Shikamaru Nara had yet to make his way into the lower area of the stadium where his match was scheduled to take place. The rumblings were more akin to shouts in one particular area of the arena, however. This was due to the fact that the absent Nara happened to be inhabiting the northernmost stands of the seating. Worse yet, he was hardly responding to the jeers and complaints of the people around him. Instead, he was simply leaning on the railing with a classically bored expression plastered on his face. Just get down there already. They'll shut up if you do, Naruto, who was sitting a few feet to his left, urged him. The shadow user sighed and glanced down into the arena, where Temari and Genma impatiently awaited him. He then scratched the side of his face pensively. I really don't feel like doing this, he muttered dejectedly. Before he could think any further, he was hoisted off his feet from behind by Naruto. As he was suspended in the air, Shikamaru kicked around to no effect. What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his eyes widening as Naruto dangled him over the edge of the railing by the back of his collar. The crowd behind the two boys voiced their approval loudly as the blonde slowly loosened his grip on his comrade's shirt. Making you participate. I'm sick of all this yelling. Have fun, buddy, Naruto replied as he released his hold on Shikamaru before any further protest could escape the Nara's mouth. A surprisingly feminine screech tore from Shikamaru's throat as he plummeted down towards the ground below. Naruto stifled a laugh as his comrade hit the dirt with a thud. Don't you think that was a little harsh? The blonde glanced over his shoulder to face the familiar voice that had just interjected. The owner of said voice was Kakashi, who had just arrived in the stands of the stadium. Naruto shrugged and turned his attention back to the floor of the arena. There'd have been a riot if I hadn't given him some encouragement, he justified nonchalantly. The Jonin sighed and sat down next to his brash student. I'd hardly call that encouragement. More like assault, he said as he made himself comfortable in the average seating of the commoners section. Before either one of them could comment on the match that was set to begin, a crashing sound came from down below. After a moment of confusion, what had occurred became clear. Seemingly having been pushed beyond the limits of her patience, Temari had unleashed a blast of chakra-infused wind with a swipe of her fan. A large cloud of dust had been thrown up into the air by the attack. Wait, is that legal? I don't think that match has started yet, Naruto asked as the crowd looked on in anticipation. Kakashi dusted off the front of his flak jacket. It should be, but I don't think Genma cares all that much. He'd like nothing more than these fights to end as quickly as possible. Refereeing. Trust me, he replied. Naruto gave him a puzzled look. What makes you say that? He asked skeptically. His sensei gestured down towards the arena, where the dust had begun to clear away. The proctor had stepped away from the center of the stadium, and was now observing the two genin from afar. So he's just letting that go. Seems unfair to me, Naruto grumbled as Shikamaru sprinted to his left to avoid being shredded by another blast of wind. Kakashi winced as the unmotivated genin tripped and fell onto his side hard. He was late to the match, so I guess this is his punishment. Not that it changes things all that much. This is how this fight was always going to look from the outset, he said. Naruto frowned at the latter half of the statement. What? He can totally win this, he said. The silver-haired ninja nodded in agreement and shifted in his seat to better view the fight that was suddenly raging in the lower arena. I never said he couldn't win. He definitely can. What I meant was that he's a pathologically slow starter. It's just who he is. Asuma's told me stories about just how long it takes him to get going during drills. This Tamari girl is nothing if not willing. She's initiative personified, he explained. Before the genin could respond, Tamari leapt backwards suddenly. Once she landed, she backpedaled quickly. She was avoiding something. After focusing his vision on the girl, he noticed a strand of what appeared to be a shadow chasing after her. So, she knows what she needs to avoid. Looks like she's done her homework, Kakashi commented as the participants assessed one another from a long, comfortable distance. Is that good or bad? Naruto asked. The Jonin studied the battlefield below and pondered the outwardly simple question, considering the numerous facets it contained. Could be either, depending on how they each adjust. On the one hand, Shikamaru now knows he can move her around the arena just by sticking his shadow out at her, but on the other, Tamari will become more and more sure of his range the more he does it. Both need to tread carefully, he replied. The next 3 minutes were fairly uneventful, but the exact pattern Kakashi had predicted became a reality. With gaps in between, Shikamaru would probe at Tamari's location with his extended shadow. Each time he did so, the fan wielder would retreat a few feet. Interestingly, Tamari ceased her ranged assault on the Nara during this lull in action. One of two things is happening right now. Either Shikamaru is playing her, or she's tricked him into thinking that he is, Kakashi said vaguely as he and his student observed the metaphorical chess match. Naruto frowned at the statement. What do you mean? He asked skeptically. The Jonin pointed to the space between the two participants, prompting Naruto to focus on it. Distance is absolutely everything right now. Tamari needs to maintain a distance that allows her to both be beyond his range, but still close enough for her wind to reach him when she attacks. Shikamaru needs to find a way to corner her by the wall to slow her retreat to the point that he can link their shadows, he explained. The blonde nodded. Yeah, I know that. That still doesn't explain what you said about one of two things happening, he pointed out. The silver-haired ninja took a moment to configure a concise way to define the meaning of his previous declaration. Shikamaru is running her around the arena with no resistance every time his shadow moves, which either means that she's terrified of it to the extent that she's willing to sacrifice her position to avoid it, or she's letting him move her to figure out his maximum range, he said. Naruto considered the explanation and assessed the match taking place before him. Kind of a weird fight, honestly. Not a ton of real action, but it sounds like there's a lot going on underneath it all, he pondered. Seemingly in scorn of his characterization of the match as uneventful, Tamari's patience wore away. She unleashed a massive blast of wind in the direction of Shikamaru. Unfortunately for the viewers of the exam, the effects of the assault were obstructed by the massive dust cloud the jutsu had created. Once it cleared, however, the crowd was rewarded with a shocking sight. In the middle of the chaos induced by Tamari's wind, Shikamaru's shadow had somehow found its way to within inches of his opponent's. Kakashi grinned underneath his mask and clapped in approval of the development. The kid's crafty as hell. He was banking on her losing her patience and trying to crush him with that wind jutsu again. He even moved himself to the one part of the arena without any grass in order to make sure the dust cloud would be large enough. Unfortunately for him, though, Tamari's cautious approach to distance management saved her. She made an educated guess as to what his furthest possible range was, and she got it right. They cancelled each other out, he said. Naruto stared down at the battleground and whistled. Damn, that close, huh? 6 more inches and he's got her snared. He'll get her next time, he said confidently. His teacher stroked his chin and lost himself in thought for a moment. Maybe, but she also knows that her guess was exactly correct. She can still hit him from that distance. Shikamaru has avenues to win this, but he'll need to willingly walk into that hurricane to do it. He's not fast enough to blindside her. Temari's power advantage is a major hurdle, he said analytically. As the coming battle would prove, the Jonin's eye for tactics was far from inaccurate. This is getting a little dicey. She can't afford to just waste chakra trying to blow him away, Kankuro said somewhat nervously as Shikamaru emerged from behind a tree with little visible injury. The shadow user had proven nearly impossible for Temari to directly strike with her jutsu despite his outward lack of immense speed or power. He was slippery, and he was frustrating. This may take a while, Gaara, who was leaning her weight on the railing, said blankly. Kankuro groaned and slumped into his seat. Ignoring her brother's frustrations, the redhead narrowed her eyes and assessed her sister's situation. Distance is no longer an issue, it seems. He has no way to get closer to her, and every time he tries, Temari nearly kills him. Still, though, I can't help but wonder how long this stalemate lasts. He outfoxed her last time, and nearly won the match all at once. She's still in tremendous danger, she pondered. Just as the thought had crossed her mind, Shikamaru made his move. Seemingly for no reason other than a lack of patience, he extended his shadow forward in Temari's direction. Given her prior knowledge of his jutsu's limited range, the fan wielder remained stationary with a smirk on her face. Once the tip of the elongated shadow reached the marking that represented Shikamaru's supposed boundary, however, it simply kept advancing. This development forced the San Kunoichi to rapidly retreat back towards the wall. The shadow ceased its forward movement just shy of the wall being cast by the wall that was now to Temari's back. She had been exceptionally lucky, but she had avoided capture once again. Gaara shook her head and allowed a ghost of a smile to form on her face. You've met your match, elder sister. He's your worst nightmare, she mused humorously. Kankuro was far less amused by the near checkmate. He just keeps getting lucky. He can't run forever. She'll carve him up eventually, he said tensely. Gaara shook her head, much to his irritation. I doubt it, unfortunately. None of what he's done has been luck-based. He threw her woefully out of position the first time he attacked, and this most recent scheme revolved around waiting just long enough for the sun to move into the proper position for the wall's shadow to lengthen. He's very smart. Smarter than she is, I'd venture, she said bluntly. The puppeteer clenched his jaw and stood up to join his sister at the railing. He doesn't have much to work with. The longer this goes, the worse it gets for him, he said. Gaara nodded in agreement and studied the lazy genin below. True enough, but his options aren't exhausted yet. There are still things he can exploit, she said. Kankuro snorted. Whose side are you on, anyways? He asked sarcastically. The Jinchuriki shrugged her shoulders and brushed back her bangs. If she can't find a way to win, then that's her fault. I'm unbiased. Whoever wins is entirely inconsequential, she said. Her eyes then shifted from the arena to her scowling brother. Because we're not here in the spirit of competition. Or do you need to be reminded of that fact? She asked, a low undertone of menace audible in her voice. Kankuro shook his head and sighed. No, I get it. I just want her to win. It'll be easier to finish this job if she's in one piece, he said honestly. Gaara remained silent and returned her gaze to the match. Temari had carefully circled herself away from the wall, and was now within striking distance once again. Unfortunately, Shikamaru had occupied himself in an area devoid of vegetation once again. Another dust cloud would be formed, shadow and all, if she chose to attack him. Incurring another such incident would be metaphorical suicide. What happened next was shocking. Breaking the rhythm of the methodical battle entirely, Shikamaru sprinted from his position towards Temari. Predictably, the fan wielder took action to intercept him with her fan. The blast of wind slammed into Shikamaru's chest and launched him backwards in brutal fashion, but not before he tossed something straight up into the air. It was small and cylindrical, and it had a tag wrapped around it. Realizing what it was just in time, Gaara turned away from the arena. A split second later, a blinding flash of light erupted from the small object. The bright light was accompanied by a high-pitched screeching sound that was utterly deafening. After a moment, Gaara turned back towards the arena to view the effects of the diversion. What she saw drew a sigh from her lips. Shikamaru's shadow was now attached to Temari's. Temari's vision slowly cleared as the world around her ceased spinning. Her senses were a mess, and her body was numb. Once her ears had stopped ringing, she attempted to sit up. Strangely, she found that her body was immobile. It took her all of a few seconds to realize what such a thing meant. Forcing her neck to crane downwards against the will of the force controlling her, she saw that her shadow was now linked to her opponent's. Shikamaru was lying nearly 40 feet away, his back flat on the ground and his arms splayed out on either side. Slowly but surely, he sat up, causing Temari to follow suit. After several painstaking movements, the pair stood across from one another with mirrored postures. Shikamaru was by far the worse for wear of the two. The final jutsu Temari had performed had badly damaged his upper chest, and his face was cut open in numerous areas. Despite his injuries, he looked quite pleased with himself. A flashbang, huh, that's a little cheap, don't you think? Temari asked in a strained tone. Shikamaru shrugged his shoulders and wiped a bit of blood from his eyes. Not really. We're permitted to use them, and you didn't know how to counter it. It was totally fair, he replied. The kunoichi growled and struggled against his control to no avail. The Nara then began to walk towards her. Due to the linking of their shadows, Temari's body did the same. Eventually, they stood roughly 3 feet from one another. Should I knock you out or just stab you? I'm open to ideas, Shikamaru joked. Temari's scowl hardened further. Here's an idea. Goa, she snapped. The shadow user chuckled and raised a hand above his head. Temari flinched as he did so, silently fearing the inevitable outcome. I'm done. Call the match, the shadow user called to Genma. Temari's eyes widened to saucers as she regained control of her body. What the hell are you doing? She demanded. Shikamaru coughed into his left hand painfully and studied it with a frown. You probably collapsed my sternum with your wind, and I'm losing a lot of blood. That, and I'm low on chakra. I'd rather live to do something with my life than cripple myself to win a pointless fight, he explained as he hobbled away towards the stairwell. Before she could respond, Genma appeared by her side and raised her hand. Shikamaru Nara has surrendered. Temari of the desert is the winner, he announced to the crowd, who were all booing the result loudly. Opting to suppress her frustrations for the time being, Temari stomped away to the opposite stairwell. Waiting for her at the entrance was Gaara, who wore a blank facial expression. Well fought, Temari, she complimented as the fan wielder stomped up the stairs as quickly as she possibly could. Like hell it was. He caught me the dumbest way he could have. With a goddamn flashbang, she grumbled. The redhead followed after her and put a hand on her shoulder, using it to turn her around. I understand that you're frustrated, but you still managed to come out of it more or less unscathed. You know as well as I do that your lack of injury is more important than the result, she said. Temari opened her mouth to snap back, but shut it again and sighed. Yeah, you're right, I'll just have to take another crack at him once things get rolling, she said tiredly. Gaara nodded and released her. The girls then made their way back up to the observation area. The match of most interest was yet to occur. Naruto paced around the bottom of the stairwell nervously. His match was set to begin in 5 minutes' time, and his opponent was far from a pushover. Neji Hyuga was favored 5-1 by the betting public to win the tournament as a whole, 12-1 to defeat Naruto. The odds were against the blonde, literally and figuratively. He hated losing, especially to those he disliked strongly. The pressure was mounting, and Naruto was feeling its effects. All I have to do is carry out the plan Kakashi-sensei laid out for me. It should work. It really should, he coached himself silently. As he tried and failed to increase his self-confidence, footsteps began to echo through the room from above. Naruto glanced over his shoulder and sighed as he spotted Sasuke making his way down the steps. Shouldn't you be warming up too? It's not like you have more than an hour, he asked. The Uchiha shook his head and studied his teammate. I'll be just fine. I'm here to make sure you are too. Can't have you losing before I get my hands on you, he said with a grin. Naruto chuckled and returned the smile, though it quickly vanished. Do you think I can beat him? he asked. Sasuke nodded and cracked his stiff neck on either side. Yeah, I do. He's stronger than you, but I think he'd have to get you out of there early. You're going to overwhelm him. I'm pretty sure of that, he assured the blonde. Naruto thought back to the many conversations he and Kakashi had shared regarding the match with Neji. Sensei said something similar. I have a specific way I'm planning on approaching this to make that kind of fight happen. Stamina is my edge, so I've gotta press it, he said. So quit doubting yourself. You've got a plan and you know what you need to do and how to do it. If Shikamaru could find a way to pull a win out of his the way he did, you can do it too, Sasuke said encouragingly. Naruto nodded and glanced up at the clock. 2 minutes remained until the scheduled time. Thanks for the confidence boost. You should get going. I'm gonna head out there a little early, he said. Sasuke nodded and disappeared back up the stairs. Naruto took a deep breath and took a step towards the door. Showtime. Naruto's eyes narrowed as the shadow of a figure became visible at the bottom of the stairwell opposite him. The owner of said shadow was known to him, but there was a feeling of anxiety racking the blonde all the same. Mere seconds later, the shadow was replaced by the distant outline of Neji Hyuga. As he approached, his features became clearer. He wore a look of arrogant self-assurance, and his posture reflected his facial expression. There wasn't even the slightest hint of tenseness to him. Complete and utter confidence. Not a care in the world. Isn't he a minute late? Naruto asked Genma, who was standing beside him in the center of the arena. The proctor glanced at him and shrugged his shoulders casually. Yeah, he is. Honestly, I don't care as long as they show up within 10 minutes of the scheduled time. We have wiggle room, he explained tiredly. The Jinchuriki grumbled something unintelligible to himself and straightened his posture as Neji came within spitting distance. He stopped advancing 5 feet from Naruto. The boys maintained eye contact sternly, prompting Genma to clear his throat. Alright, you both know what I expect. This'll be a clean, fair fight. No outside help of any kind is permitted, and any such occurrences will result in instant disqualification. These fights aren't scored, so you'd be wise to work to finish, he relayed as though he were reading from a script, which he likely was in some way. Concise as his words were, neither genin had heard an ounce of it. Recognizing this fact quickly, Genma retreated a few feet and raised his arm above his head symbolically. Since you both appear to be ready, take 10 steps back so we can get this rolling, he ordered the boys. They each obliged and moved back the appropriate distance before settling into their respective stances. The proctor then chopped his arm downward. Begin, he yelled, disappearing into a puff of smoke a split second after the word had left his mouth. Naruto wasted no time. He rushed across the space between them and slung an overhand punch with his right hand at Neji's jaw. Predictably, he missed by a mile. The Hyuga easily and smoothly drifted backwards out of range. Despite the fact that he had missed his supposed target entirely, a grin appeared on Naruto's face as he rebalanced himself and returned to pressuring forward. Let's try that again, he thought to himself. He then surged forward again and launched the same punch at his opponent. As expected, he paid for it this time. Instead of simply retreating, Neji pulled his head back with his feet firmly rooted. Naruto's punch sailed by an inch from his nose, and as the blonde fell forward due to his own momentum, Neji drove his left knee upward into his ribs. The Jinchuriki, much to Neji's surprise, simply absorbed the strike and took the opportunity to seize his leg. The Hyuga grunted and tried to pull his leg free, a forceful request that Naruto willingly granted. As Neji attempted to reposition his feet, he was cracked across the right side of his jaw by a hooking punch from the blonde. Partially due to an already existent lack of balance, Neji dropped to his rear end. He popped back to his feet immediately, but the crowd reacted strongly nonetheless. A low growl escaped from his chest as he narrowed his eyes and assessed his more competent than expected foe. First blood is yours, Naruto. Well done, he admitted to calm himself. Naruto raised an eyebrow and prepared to engage once more. Didn't think I'd ever get a compliment out of you, he remarked. Neji scowled and blitzed forward to meet his advance. Unlike the previous exchange, the Hyuga led the metaphorical dance. He intercepted Naruto's linear charge by slamming his left palm into the bottom of his chin and snapping his head back. "And it's the last you'll get," he sneered before kicking Naruto's left leg inward into his stance and off-balancing him. The blonde stumbled away and fumbled for his positioning, but Neji pursued him before he could regain his stability. The Hyuga jabbed him 6 times. Twice on either side of his chest and twice on each arm. His upper body instantly numbed. Finishing the combination dramatically, Neji kicked Naruto in the stomach and launched him backwards to the ground forcefully. The Jinchuriki grunted and forced himself to stand shockingly quickly, drawing a smirk from Neji. "You're durable as they come. Most are finished after having the feeling in their upper body cut off," he said as Naruto rolled his shoulders to regain some semblance of control. The blonde then cracked his neck and stepped back into his stance. In a flash, he disappeared. A split second later, his fist was buried in Neji's stomach. The arrogant genin coughed painfully and gripped his foe's wrist to remove it from his abdomen. After a brief struggle, he managed to make space and retreat to attempt to catch his wind. Shunshin, also known as the body flicker. Commonly used, but almost never for combat. "He's certainly resourceful," he thought to himself as Naruto forcibly pressured him into another exchange of blows. Neji decisively won the first clash. He pivoted off of Naruto's centerline and checked him with a short hook to the right side of his jaw, but the second layer of the firefight was far less clean. In spite of the dominant angle Neji had taken, Naruto shifted his stance so that his left side was in position to be fired with force. The improvisation provided a clear target, that being the center of Neji's forehead. The blonde stepped deep into Neji's space and slammed a straight, left-handed punch between his eyes. The Hyuga flinched and skittered back to recreate distance, but Naruto followed him out of range with a kick across the right side of his ribcage. Neji took a deep breath to collect himself, but his regathering was interrupted by the feeling of a hard surface touching his back. Taking a brief risk to glance behind him, the Hyuga clenched his jaw. Naruto had forced him backwards to the wall. A two-pronged tactic. Extend exchanges to increase his chances of landing strikes, and move me to the boundary in order to decrease my space to move. Sharp decision-making, he thought to himself. A sigh then escaped his lips as the veins on the side of his head became visible. A moment later, his purple, pupilless eyes flared. Naruto's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the development, but he remained poised. Neji widened his stance and fixed his now active dojutsu on the Jinchuriki. "You've earned my intrigue. Now I'm going to make you regret being so interesting." Kakashi drummed his fingers nervously as Naruto narrowly avoided having his head removed by Neji's shinbone. The approach he had given his student to work with was being well executed, but the preemptive risks still remained. The gap in technical depth in terms of taijutsu was large, particularly in the defensive realm. Neji was hardly hit clean when he was hit at all, but Naruto was being forced to endure viciously crisp return fire from his adversary every time he engaged. At the present moment, the fight was trending in the desired direction positionally speaking. Naruto had succeeded in putting Neji's back to the wall fairly quickly, and he was applying heavy pressure. So, this is what he meant when he said he was going to press his stamina edge. Kakashi glanced back over his shoulder and spotted Sasuke entering the stands. The Uchiha made his way to the left of his sensei and took a seat next to him. "He's pushing hard. Like, really hard," he commented as his teammate tagged the Hyuga thrice with repeated left-handed punches. The Jonin nodded and quit drumming his fingers. He has to if he wants to win. Neji is faster, stronger, and sharper than him. Pace and attrition are his path to victory. All I did was give him specific tools and tactics to apply. I guess you could say I cleaned up his pressure, he explained. Sasuke grimaced as Naruto was nearly doubled over by a harsh palm strike to his abdomen. He definitely looks smarter than he normally does. He's doing a decent job of cutting Neji off at the pass with those kicks to the ribs, and he's refusing to give him any free shots, he observed. Another blinding exchange drew a look of excitement from Sasuke. Naruto had broken Neji's nose, and blood was now leaking from the Hyuga's nostrils. Not sure what he hit him with, but it definitely worked, he said hopefully as his teammate increased his volume of strikes to further press his semi-compromised foe. His attempt to flurry was cut short by a hard counter that sent him back a step, but a subtle shift in momentum seemed to be occurring. He headbutted him, I think. Not the cleanest shot, but definitely effective, Kakashi said with a chuckle. A question then crossed Sasuke's mind as he watched his teammate valiantly enforce his pace. Why only taijutsu? Shouldn't he be using clones or something? He asked. The silver-haired ninja shook his head and gestured to his eyes in relation to Neji's. Clones are worthless here for a number of reasons. Most prominently, Neji's Byakugan makes him just about impossible to blindside. It would be a waste of chakra. As for other ninjutsu, he just isn't fast enough to make what he knows how to use work. This game plan is all about Naruto outlasting him down the stretch, he explained. Sasuke gave a short nod before returning his attention to the match raging below. I just hope he doesn't end up getting seriously hurt trying to tire him out, he said. Kakashi pursed his lips and fixed his eyes on Naruto, who was breathing heavily. That's the risk he's gotta take. It's up to him to make this work. Naruto spat blood out of his mouth as he doggedly pursued Neji along the perimeter of the arena. Exhaustion was setting in, but now was not the time to question the limitations of his own body. Neji was slowing as well, and arguably more so. His counters were lessening in force and consistency each time they crashed together, and his face was badly bruised from Naruto's punches. Resolving himself to dive deeper into the depths of weariness, the blonde stepped into striking range for what could have been the 100th time that match. He speared out his left hand toward Neji's face, a strike that the Hyuga avoided by slipping head inside the arc of the punch. Having anticipated the defensive counter, Naruto quickly pulled his head back. Neji's returning strike was a wide, right-handed punch that whizzed by the Jinchuriki's head, and as his arm dropped as a result of his lack of connection, Naruto drilled his temple with a punch of his own off of his rear right hand. The impact momentarily buckled the Hyuga's knees and caused him to lean against the wall for support. The blonde grinned and stepped in further until they were practically forehead to forehead. Not used to a dog fight, are you? He asked as he ripped two punches into either side of his foe's ribcage. Neji responded to the cruel attack on his abdomen with a cleaving elbow to the left side of Naruto's forehead that split his skin and drew blood. What he did next was far more extreme. Taking advantage of the close proximity both he and the blonde were now operating at, the Hyuga made a sharp turn on the ball of his foot to create momentum. Rotation, yelled as he spun around rapidly at point-blank range. Before Naruto could react, a wall of chakra slammed into his chest and launched him nearly 20 feet in the opposite direction. He hit the hard ground with a loud thud that knocked every ounce of air from his lungs. His ears were ringing loudly as he sat up in a daze. The front of his jacket had been shredded and burned by Neji's chakra, and his skin was singed. He promptly removed his jacket and tossed it aside, leaving only his charred undershirt. Neji had made his way back to the center of the arena as well, and he looked no better off. While he had been the one inflicting damage, the chakra he had expended was clearly taking its toll on him. The end was near, and both knew it. The winner would be decided by who was able to move forward. Neither had the energy to retreat and counter for one reason or another. Quit staring and hit me, Naruto growled as they approached each other slowly. Neji scowled and closed the rest of the distance between them with a head-turning punch to the left side of his jaw. Naruto's head was turned to the side by the cracking strike, but he remained standing and seized the Hyuga's wrist as he retracted the punch. Using the grip to his advantage, the blonde yanked Neji forward and ran him into a short uppercut that snapped his head upward. Like Naruto, Neji refused to budge. Instead, he speared his knee into the Jinchuriki's stomach and shoved him backwards. I'd keep your mouth shut if I were you. Your jaw is more easily broken when you speak, he snapped back. Naruto laughed at the remark and wiped a trail of blood from his chin. For such a sure or tough. Can't take that away from you, he said humorously before rushing in and connecting clean with a straight, right-handed punch to Neji's cheek. The Hyuga retaliated with a forceful palm strike to his chest that elicited a painful sputter of red phlegm from Naruto. You're grittier than you are skilled. Take that as you will, Neji breathed. The Jinchuriki heaved a deep breath and prepared to attack once more. As he approached, Neji caught a glimpse of what looked to a shade of red flashing across Naruto's eyes. Kankuro watched his sister intently as she kept her eyes glued to the arena below. Generally speaking, the girl was far from reactive. In fact, she was quite the opposite. She hardly reacted to any social or situational cues. Be them major or minor, her expressions and body language always remained static and stoic. Currently, however, that trend was being broken. Numerous times throughout the encounter between Neji Hyuga and Naruto Uzumaki, Gaara had visibly flinched. In fact, when Neji had brutally floored Naruto with his violent rotation technique, she had looked visibly horrified. At the present, she was far more difficult to read. The exchanges between the warring genin were close to even, and one could argue that the blonde was landing the more eye-catching strikes. If anything, Naruto looked to somehow be gaining steam. If charted on a graph, his volume of strikes would have shown a clear trend upward before a steep decline. Now, that decline was being defied. It was subtle, but his vitality was returning to him. As Kankuro pondered as to why this was, Gaara spoke for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. Naruto has won. This fight is effectively over, she said confidently as Naruto kicked out one of Neji's legs. Kankuro was forced to nod in agreement as the blonde began to wear down his foe with increasing tenacity. Yeah, looks that way. How, though? He was wind a minute ago, he asked. Gaara smirked and folded her arms in front of her chest. He finally ran out of chakra. It's clear as day that he has no real control over his demon, but its chakra involuntarily seeps into his body when he's out of energy. He had a backup. Neji didn't. She explained as the boy she clearly favored staggered his foe with a counter. Kankuro then took a risky bet. What's the point in rooting for him? You're going to kill him in, like, an hour. Why are you so invested? He asked. Gaara instantly darkened and tensed. Her grip on the rail tightened, her eyes lowered, and her shoulders bunched together. Am I not entitled to enjoying him a bit more before I snuff him out? She muttered. Kankuro instantly felt a pang of sympathy for his sister, though it came alongside a strong feeling of unease. Openness was a rarity on Gaara's part, but when it did occur, it tended to be somewhat morbid. Why yeah, that's fine. I was just making sure, he said awkwardly as the redhead sulked. After a few moments of tense silence, Gaara sighed and glanced back at her brother. I'm aware of what must be done, Kankuro. When the time comes, I'll bury him. That time has yet to come, though. For now, he's still a joy of mine, she said. The puppeteer's face softened at her words. Gaara, he lamented within his mind. Choosing to think of less depressing topics, he returned his eyes to the battle. From the looks of things, it was well on its way to being finished. Looks like you might be fighting soon. You might want to start warming up, he said to his sister. The redhead nodded, but remained fixated on the arena. I prefer to let my opponents warm me up. Not that they ever do much more than that. Neji grimaced as his abdomen was assaulted by the fists of Naruto Uzumaki. Over and over, his knuckles ripped into his ribs and stomach. There was no end to the barrage. There were breaks, there were pauses, but never a conclusion. Even after having appeared to be exhausted minutes earlier, Naruto had come surging back with renewed fury to batter the Hyuga pillar to post. His stamina was inhuman, his durability nonsensical, and his will unbreakable. He was technically outclassed as well as being the naturally weaker of the two, but he had weaponized his pace brilliantly. Give him an inch and he'll take it a mile. Well done, Naruto, Neji lamented as he pivoted out to his left to avoid a linear charge from his foe. Naruto's return to his pressuring ways was more than a bit puzzling, given that his cardio seemed to have been failing him not long ago. Neji's Byakugan had both lessened and increased his number of questions pertaining to the topic. When active, his dojutsu revealed a burning orange chakra coursing through the blonde's body in place of the natural blue that permeated every other living thing. It was clearly the source of his revitalization, but the origin of this orange substance was unknown to the Hyuga. There was no time to ponder such things, though. Breathing room was to be cherished, and Neji was making the most of his momentary freedom to move. The Hyuga made his way as far toward the center of the arena as he could with Naruto in hot pursuit. When retreat was no longer an option, Neji planted his feet and thrust out a stiff palm strike with his left arm to intercept Naruto as he charged forward. As the blonde entered range, however, he moved his head to his own left and inside of Neji's strike. He then fired a right-handed punch over the top of Neji's left shoulder and clobbered him on the temple. Neji's knees buckled and nearly gave out, but he managed to maintain his footing by seizing Naruto by the back of the neck with one hand. With a grunt of effort, he snapped the blonde's head down into the point of his rising knee. His kneecap collided harshly with the skin above Naruto's left eye and tore it open, sending a stream of blood down his face as he yanked himself away from the Hyuga. For a brief moment, he wiped blood from his forehead and winced. The plasma was dripping into his eye. Realizing that an opportunity had presented itself, Neji steeled himself and took a deep breath. 8 trigrams, 64 palms. He yelled. It would be his final push, and he knew it. Naruto's eyes widened as Neji's stance lowered and dojutsu flared. A moment later, the Hyuga vanished from sight. When he reappeared, he began a horrific flurry of strikes. First, he struck the blonde twice. Then 4 times, then 8, then 16, and finally a massive barrage of 32 consecutive palm strikes aimed at every target available on the human frame. Every single strike landed squarely, and the 64th strike sent Naruto sailing backwards to the ground with a forceful thud. His impact with the hard sediment elicited a painful, bloody cough from the Jinchuriki. As he twitched on the ground, Neji looked to the distant Genma. I'd start to think about stopping this if I were you. I doubt he's getting up again, he called breathlessly. For a brief moment, it seemed that the proctor was going to oblige. He took steps to approach the genin, but stopped nearly immediately. Realizing that it would be wise to view his foe once more, Neji slowly turned his head towards Naruto. The unpopular genin had somehow made his way to his knees, and he was attempting to rise to his feet. Through what appeared to be a Herculean effort, he made his way to an upright posture. What truly caught Neji's attention, however, was the now visible outline of red that encompassed his body. His eyes were blood red, and his pupils were slitted. He had changed. Rather than react with shock and awe as his instincts told him to, Neji simply allowed his body to relax. His arms fell to his sides, his taijutsu stance evaporated, and he simply marveled at the boy before him. After a second or two, he sighed and shook his head. What on earth are you, Naruto? Or do you not even know yourself? He asked. The Jinchuriki remained silent initially, but soon responded in shockingly calm fashion. A bit of both. I know what this chakra is, but I don't know how to use it or even how to access it. I got lucky, he began. Before Neji could reply, a horrific punch clattered the left side of his jaw. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. Naruto, who had crossed the distance between them in the blink of an eye, watched the Hyuga crumple into a heap at his feet. And you didn't, he concluded. Genma was between them instantly, and he waved his hands over Neji's limp form symbolically. Neji Hyuga is unconscious. Naruto Uzumaki is the winner. He announced to the crowd, who promptly let out a roar of approval at the massive upset that had just occurred. Realizing that he could finally relax, Naruto let out a heavy sigh and allowed the demonic chakra to drain away. He then took a moment to survey the cheering crowd. Each and every person he focused his vision on was clapping, and many of them were smiling. A grin slowly spread across his face as the reality of his victory became clear to him. He had defeated the majority favorite to win the exams as a whole, and he had done so in fairly definitive fashion. So, this is what it feels like, he mused to himself quietly as he took in the approval of those around him. In his heart of hearts, he knew it to be temporary, but he was in no position to be picky. As he enjoyed his moment of triumph, however, the adrenaline circulating through his body waned away. The moment it was gone, his strength left him entirely. He dropped down to one knee and coughed raggedly into his hand. When the wheezing finally subsided, he glanced down at his palm. It was stained dark red. Damn it, he muttered. Just as he began to panic, he was hoisted to his feet by an unknown figure. Careful, Naruto. Take it easy. You'll heal on your own. Just try to walk slowly, Kakashi said calmly as he led his student away towards the stairwell. The blonde glanced at his teacher as he was helped along and nodded. Yeah, I know. It just right now. I'll probably need at least an hour to be ready to fight again, he said honestly. The pair then began to traverse the stairs at a snail's pace, eventually reaching the top after a struggle. Instead of taking the turn to return to the observation area, however, Kakashi took him in the opposite direction down another hallway. Where are we going? The seats are that way, Naruto asked skeptically. Kakashi shook his head and increased the pace at which he was walking. I'm taking you to the infirmary. They can't help you in any meaningful way, but they can patch up your flesh wounds and give you something for the headache I'm guessing you have, he explained. The Jinchuriki sighed in relief at the idea of his pounding head being soothed. How'd I do? He asked after a moment of silence. The Jonin gave his student a thumbs up as they entered the sick hall of the arena's surprisingly complicated interior. Very well. He was a hell of a lot mentally tougher than I thought he'd be, but you did what you had to do, he assured him. They then reached a particular room, where Kakashi came to a halt. He directed Naruto inside and muttered a few things to the resident nurse before turning to leave his pupil. Before stepping fully out of the room, however, he glanced back over his shoulder. Consider taking a nap. I doubt Sasuke and Gaara's fight is going to end quickly or cleanly. Sasuke took a deep breath and stood up from his seat. He was set to compete in 30 minutes' time, and his opponent was daunting. Plenty of careful preparation had been performed during the month between the preliminary and final rounds, but despite it, the Uchiha felt stress creeping into his subconscious. In spite of his careful studying and meticulous attention to detail, he knew very little of his opponent past the established facts revealed by her match with Lee. She was fairly slow-moving, more or less entirely stationary in combat, and when she was hit, she tended to be hit cleanly. Those were the weaknesses Rock Lee had exploited to the best of his ability during his futile effort against the redhead. It was plenty to work with, broadly speaking. There were plenty of avenues to victory available on paper should Gaara's shortcomings be taken at face value. Unfortunately, it was far from being that simple. Struggle though she did, Gaara never came even remotely close to losing her battle with Lee. At every stage, at every turn, she was in Gaara was marked, Lee was damaged. When Gaara was uncomfortable, Lee was panicked. In the end, when Gaara was injured, Lee was finished. I can't hang my hat on how shaky she looked at points. She wasn't even sweating. She knew she didn't need to show anything else. Durability won her that fight on its own. When push comes to shove, she has more power in reserve. I know she does, Sasuke thought to himself as he began his trek towards the bathroom in order to relieve himself. The brief journey took him around a nearby corner, where he spotted Kakashi making his way down in the opposite direction. Opting to wait and converse with his sensei, Sasuke leaned against the wall and awaited the eventual arrival of the Jonin at his location. How's Naruto holding up? He asked once Kakashi was within earshot. The silver-haired ninja shrugged his shoulders and leaned against the wall opposite his pupil. About as well as can be expected given the ringer he just put himself through. He says he needs an hour to be fight ready, he said. The Uchiha nodded and brushed back his bangs. Yeah, about what I expected. Neji didn't go easy. That was always going to be a hard one for Naruto to win. Glad he pulled it off, though, he replied. Kakashi folded his arms in front of himself and drummed his fingers against his bicep. That late rally was incredibly brave from Neji. For such an egomaniac, he has a dog buried somewhere inside him. Enough about that, though. You have a fight soon. Any particular reason you aren't warming up? He asked. Sasuke sighed and lowered his eyes to the floor. I'm trying not to overthink this. I know what I have to do, and I think I can pull it off, but the more I think about it, the less confident I become, he admitted. The Jonin raised an eyebrow at his explanation. Dissociation is a weird way to get ready for a fight with a Jinchuriki, but who am I to judge? Do what works for you, he said. The Genin pursed his lips and considered his opponent once more. What do you think of her? You had me drill a lot of things, but you never really told me much about what you think of her as an opponent, he asked. Kakashi pondered the question briefly. I think the best way to put it is that she's a wind-up toy, he said vaguely. Sasuke glanced up from the floor and frowned. What the hell does that mean? He questioned. The Jonin chuckled and shook his head humorously at the boy's confusion. Just a metaphor. What I mean by that is that she's reactive. She doesn't like to initiate all that much from what I can tell. She's defensive 90% of the time, and the other 10% is really just posturing, he clarified. After taking a moment to better understand the meaning behind his teacher's words, the Uchiha nodded reluctantly. Yeah, that makes sense. Don't you think that she's hiding power, though? I think it's likely, he said. Kakashi shrugged his shoulders. Probably, but you have an equalizer. I taught you Chidori for a reason, kid, he replied. The Uchiha shuddered as he recalled the many days of numbness his arm had experienced during the learning process. That's true, I guess. If I can run her through early, then whatever she's hiding doesn't matter, he said thoughtfully. Kakashi eyed him intently. Don't try to force that opening. It will present itself, but you have to be patient. Remember, you only have 2 shots with that thing before you're crippled, he reminded his young pupil. Yeah, I get it. I just want this to be shorter rather than longer, you know. Sasuke said. Kakashi nodded and gestured to his forehead protector. Quick and clean is the motto of covert operations, so if that's your mentality, then maybe you've got an Anbu career ahead of you, he joked. An awkward silence then crept into the hall they were occupying. Sorry. That was a little insensitive, the Jonin apologized. The Uchiha waved a dismissive hand and peeled himself off of the wall he was leaning on. No, you're fine. You didn't mean it that way. I'm gonna head out for a walk. I'll be back in time. Don't worry, he said as he disappeared around the corner from whence he had come. Once he was gone, Kakashi sighed. Great. I made him uncomfortable, he scolded himself. He chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he glanced up at the clock and prepared himself for a walk of his own. Despite being the voice of reason, Kakashi needed to calm his nerves. Genma was snapped from his semi-conscious stupor by the cheers of the crowd. As proctor, he was not allowed to exit the arena under any circumstances during the exams, and it was a relentless grind. Mindless instructions, predictable matches, and merciful stoppages had a way of eating away at a man's sanity. Despite these feelings of boredom and the obvious lack of appreciation that came with such a thankless job, his task was still just that. A job that he would carry out. At present, the final match of the first half of the tournament bracket was set to begin. The crowd had roared in response to the entrance of its first participant. Sasuke Uchiha was calmly strolling down towards the center of the battlefield. He was wildly popular with the masses, and for good reason. He was gifted, handsome, and held the distinction of being the last of an otherwise extinct bloodline. All the makings of a poster boy. Helps that he can fight too, I guess, Genma mused to himself as Sasuke stopped a few feet to his left and gave him a curt nod. He was ready, and he appeared outwardly confident. Such appearances tended fabrications on such a large stage, but the mask he wore was a convincing one if nothing else. It would be another 3 minutes until the second half of the match would make her way out of the opposite stairwell, but when she did, the crowd went silent. If Sasuke's entrance had felt like a warm welcome to a local hero, Gaara's felt like the introduction at a funeral service. Few, if any, spoke as she crossed the distance between her stairs and Genma. Once she had reached a position at which she felt comfortable, she stopped walking. She had halted roughly double the distance Sasuke had from the proctor. In more ways than one, the two combatants felt like polar opposites. Gaara was short, no taller than 5 feet, and Sasuke was fairly tall for his age, as he stood 7 inches taller than the redhead. Sasuke was traditionally handsome, and Gaara was much more of a blank slate. Genma suppressed a chuckle as he watched them one another. They both need to smile more. Especially Shorty, he joked within his mind. Once he had purged himself of all humorous thoughts, he cleared his throat and glanced at both Genin. Alright, normally I'd skip right through this, because you've heard this spiel before. But, I think there are a few things I need to clarify for the two of you, he said somewhat sternly. Both Gaara and Sasuke furrowed their eyebrows and awaited elaboration. First turning to Sasuke, Genma began speaking. When performing fire-style jutsu, make sure you aim your shot carefully. The seating area is packed and flammable, he said. The Uchiha nodded wordlessly and turned his attention back to his opponent. Satisfied by his understanding, the proctor moved on to the second half of the match. I'd like to think this goes without saying, but keep your sand away from the crowd. If either one of you injures a bystander, this match is going to end up being way more complicated and convoluted than it needs to be. Needless to say, the perpetrator will be punished, he said. Gaara gave an almost imperceptible nod in response. Sensing that no more engagement could be expected from the young girl, Genma stepped back and raised his arm above his head. You both know the rules already, so I'm skipping that part. Please take 10 steps backward, he ordered them. The pair each retreated the appropriate distance and readied themselves for combat. Sasuke assumed a taijutsu stance, and Gaara simply allowed sand to leak from the gourd strapped to her back. Genma then chopped his hand down toward the ground. You may begin. Gaara wasted no time in setting her sand on a path towards Sasuke. The floating sediment launched itself away from her in the Uchiha's direction, tearing up more dust from the ground and adding it to its mass. Within seconds, the rapidly advancing slammed down onto Sasuke and sent a gasp of shock through the crowd. For a few moments, there was silence. When Gaara's sand retracted, however, there was no body. In fact, there weren't any signs of the leaf genin whatsoever. He had disappeared. Before Gaara could even begin to consider the obvious questions of where and when, she was lanced with a sharp punch across the right side of her jawline. Despite her substantial durability, the shock of the impact still buckled her knees and stunned her momentarily. You're even slower than I figured you'd be. The redhead rubbed the side of her face and glanced to her left, where Sasuke now stood with a confident smirk on his face. More striking than his sudden change in position was the stance he had adopted. One arm was tucked behind his back, and the other was outstretched with the palm facing upwards. It was identical to the posture of Rock Lee. Gaara turned fully to face him directly. I don't quite understand the point of this little stylistic shift, she said monotonously. Sasuke raised an eyebrow and shifted his feet. In a flash, he was in front of Gaara once again with his left fist buried underneath her floating ribs. The Jinchuriki grimaced and backed up a step. Her sand, unable to react in time to deflect the first debilitating blow, then flew into action. Unfortunately, Sasuke had already drifted back out to a safe distance, where he stood ready to defend himself. Lee lost to you, but he exposed a few of your weaknesses. I've got a lot to work with, he said. Gaara's expression remained unchanged at his declaration, but the pain in her ribs had yet to subside. More sand slowly trickled out from her gourd and meshed itself together with the already present material. Sasuke then twitched, prompting Gaara to react. Predicting his inevitable charge, the redhead erected a wall of sand to her left. Her anticipation proved to be correct, as Sasuke's shin slammed hard into the barrier. The Jinchuriki's sand immediately wrapped around his leg and hoisted him up into the air. And I have plenty to counter, she replied as her sand whipped him around in circles above her head. Once she had spun him in nearly 20 consecutive circles, Gaara sent the Uchiha flying towards the far wall. As he sailed away, Sasuke was able to somewhat regain his bearings. Once he did, he weaved a series of hand seals and reared his head back. Fire style. Fireball jutsu. He yelled. A blast of searing fire then erupted from his mouth and scorched towards Gaara. The redhead's sand instantly enveloped her and backed itself densely. The burning fire crashed into the shell and superheated the outer layer to the point of crystallization. The jutsu had propelled Sasuke backwards at high speed, causing him to slam into the wall he was already headed towards with an increased impact. Despite the forceful collision, the Uchiha was unfazed as he rose to his feet to admire his handiwork. Gaara was still fully visible, but through a veil of fresh glass. Said veil then began to shake. After a moment of low humming, the glass shattered into an uncountable number of pieces that mixed back into her hoard of sand. I put a lot of chakra into that. She's a tough nut to crack. Not even a singed hair, Sasuke thought to himself as he assessed the ever-calm Jinchuriki. Her composure was unnerving. Even under the most severe of duress, she hardly blinked. The speed advantage decisively belonged to Sasuke, as did the advantage in technical skill in most areas, and it was up to him to leverage those edges. Let's get busy, he encouraged himself before setting his feet and blitzing towards his stationary foe. Predictably, Gaara's sand came out to meet him. Taking a sharp angle off to his right to avoid the obstruction, Sasuke increased his speed further to take advantage of the massive opening the redhead had left him. Once the necessary distance had been crossed, Sasuke planted his feet in front of Gaara and went on the attack. First, he snapped her head back with a sharp, left-handed punch, after which he spun her jaw with a fully extended punch with his right hand. Much to his surprise, Gaara did not budge. She simply returned to her same upright posture and looked to back away. Opting to push his luck a bit more, Sasuke kicked her knee inwards and swept her off her feet before leaping out of the wake of her furious sand. Taking a deep breath as he landed on his feet 25 feet away, the Uchiha allowed a smile to form on his face. He was landing at will, and Gaara appeared to lack the wherewithal to stop him. He was winning, and quite easily at that. We've still only been fighting for less than 5 minutes. She's not done yet. I can't do anything wild yet, Sasuke thought to himself. As the sentiment crossed his mind, Gaara decided to take initiative. She sent out a spear of condensed sand whistling towards him at a speed Sasuke had not thought possible for the sediment. Forced to rely on his reflexes, Sasuke bent over backwards at the waist and narrowly avoided being impaled through the skull by the sandy spike. It missed his nose by mere inches as it sailed by his face and shattered on the wall behind him. Quickly rebounding to an erect posture, Sasuke's eyes widened as he saw another spike flying towards him. He was once again saved by his reflexive speed, as he moved his head off to the left to barely avoid another decapitation. Figuring that another was on its way towards him, Sasuke performed another series of hand seals, one far different from those required for the fireball jutsu. Earth style. Mudwall, he yelled, slamming his palms down onto the ground in front of him as he bellowed. A barrier of solid earth then rose up from the dirt and deflected the third spike that Sasuke had correctly predicted would come. The Uchiha took a deep breath and made another hand seal. Shadow clone jutsu, he muttered as quietly as he could. An exact copy of himself then appeared next to him. Already equipped with the knowledge of his task, the doppelganger drew a kunai and stepped out from behind the wall. He took no more than 10 steps forward before he was skewered by a sand spear. Despite the quick and concise destruction of his clone, the puff of smoke that followed as a result provided all the cover the Uchiha needed. Emerging from the artificial obstruction with the same blinding speed as before with a pair of kunai drawn, Sasuke easily bypassed the comparatively sluggish cloud of sand surrounding Gaara and slashed at her face with both blades. The redhead flinched and leaned back, managing to avoid one of the kunai. Unfortunately for her, the knife held in Sasuke's left hand was able to cut across her right cheek. A small spray of blood spurted out from her face as she reeled backwards. While she recovered from the laceration of her cheek, Sasuke stepped forward and kicked straight up with his right leg, planting the ball of his foot underneath her head and snapping her head back harshly. The strike caused the Jinchuriki's legs to give out and send her down onto her back. Sasuke suppressed his urge to follow her down to the ground and leapt away to avoid the oncoming sand as Gaara laid flat on the ground. Once he was safely out of range, the Uchiha watched the girl intently. For a time, she was still. Eventually, however, her left hand twitched. After that, she sat up slowly with her eyes downcast and blood dripping from her face wound. Not used to getting hit, are you? Sasuke goaded as the Jinchuriki stood to her feet slowly. It was then that Gaara turned her face up to look at the Uchiha. The gash Sasuke had opened up on her cheek was deep and profusely bloody, and her eyes had narrowed to angry slits as she stared at him. You're like a housefly. Relatively harmless, but oh so irritating. I'll squash you all the same, she said darkly, her sand beginning to erratically twitch and pulsate while she spoke. Sasuke, sensing that his ease of entry into striking distance was about to disappear, allowed his Sharingan to manifest itself in his eyes. A smirk then spread across Gaara's lips as the cut on her face began to rapidly mend itself. Odd. You're weaker than Rock Lee was at his height, and yet I still feel the need to draw on my secondary reserves. Kakashi shuddered as the temperature in the arena decreased suddenly. Something had shifted. Something important. Having felt such a feeling several times previously, Kakashi uncovered his left eye to confirm a hypothesis. Locking the Sharingan onto the recently risen Gaara, his fears were immediately confirmed. Her chakra system was overrun with a demonic red energy. It was nearly identical to the chakra of the nine-tailed fox, though less potent and slightly different in nature. Not good. Her signatures doubled in strength, and it looks like the chakra is healing her, he thought to himself in a slight panic as Sasuke evaded a tendril of sand. Another, more conflicting thought then skipped across the Jonin's mind. She really is just like Naruto. Difference is, I think she can control that power, he thought nervously. Even after the increase in power on Gaara's end, however, Sasuke was still more or less entirely dominating the battle at the present. While the redhead's sand had certainly increased its movement speed, the Uchiha remained the far faster party. He was still able to dart in and out, lacing Gaara with stabbing strikes before drifting away. Conversely, though, the consequences of a mistake would likely now be something close to fatal. Each time Gaara's sand collided with a tree or the concrete wall, destruction was left in its wake. A burst of fire then erupted in the center of the arena as Sasuke unleashed the heirloom jutsu of his family to combat an oncoming wave of Gaara's sand. The crowd roared with approval as their resident phenom battled against the foreign, disturbing power of Gaara's sand. The clash ended in what essentially amounted to a draw, as Sasuke's jutsu lost potency, but only after turning back the sand kunoichi's sediment. What happened next drew another cheer from the crowd. After having repelled Gaara's sand, Sasuke had rushed forward and knocked the Jinchuriki back several feet with a right-handed punch to the forehead. As a follow-up, he launched a barrage of shuriken in her direction that her sand was forced to deflect. The defensive maneuver came at cost, because while it did defend the redhead from the projectiles, it entirely exposed her right side. Having calculated the entire sequence within his mind a beat beforehand, Sasuke punished her for the blunder by slamming his right hand into her temple after closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Kakashi smiled at the tactics of his student. He's executing perfectly. Draw the sand in one direction with throwaway offense, and then attack for real from another, he assessed. Sasuke then connected with another rushing flurry of strikes that resulted in Gaara losing her balance and stumbling backwards. Surprisingly, the Uchiha did not capitalize on her moment of weakness. He certainly could have, given that the redhead's sand was a fair distance away from her at the moment she had been wobbled. It took very little observation for Kakashi to suss out why his pupil had hesitated. He was beginning to tire. It was subtle, but it was obvious. His breathing was becoming slightly more labored, his rushes more predictable, and his defensive reactions were dulling just a tad. He was still in control, but it was slowly starting to slip. No amount of conditioning was ever going to give him Lee's ridiculous stamina, but I figured it would take longer than this, Kakashi lamented. Sasuke then leapt backwards several feet and began to scale his way up the arena wall. When he stopped climbing, he took several deep breaths to collect himself. Even if he's tired, Gaara is giving him room to breathe more often than not. He should be fine, Kakashi thought to himself as Sasuke re-entered the fray to punch Gaara in the stomach and kick her legs out from under her. In the back of his mind, however, the Jonin knew that the fight had yet to truly reach its boiling point. Sasuke wiped sweat from his brow as he retreated away from Gaara's murderous sand. As it had been since the beginning, the Uchiha's speed had been his saving grace. Sasuke had put himself out of position more than once, but the raw quickness with which he was able to move while imitating the taijutsu of Rock Lee was generally more than enough to bail him out. This occasion was no different. He slowly skidded to a stop a fair distance from Gaara and Chidori would put a serious dent in her, but I don't know if it'd kill her. If it doesn't, she'll heal. Fireball is more or less useless offensively, and I can't really hurt her that badly with taijutsu, he thought to himself analytically. Deciding to stick with what had been working so well for him throughout the match, Sasuke focused his vision on the redhead's defensive weak points and allowed his speed to carry him across the plain between them. As he had what felt like 1,000 times, he bypassed Gaara's defenses and set his feet to unleash on the fairly defenseless girl at close range. He speared a straight, right-handed punch at her jawline and connected flush. Unlike any of the previous times he had struck her, however, Gaara's body evaporated into a cloud of sand. Instantly realizing his mistake, Sasuke made a panicked rush to escape the storm of sand he was in the eye of. Before he could move far enough, he was tripped by a limb of sand. He immediately scrambled to his feet, but was once again knocked to the ground by a mass of sand. Gaara herself then appeared from a shifting cloud of sand. I'm not entirely sure why that worked. You've defused my sand clones more than once already, she said, seizing Sasuke by the front of his shirt and hoisting him to his feet with a shocking degree of ease despite her small stature. When the Uchiha didn't respond immediately, Gaara raised an eyebrow. Did you really forget to check whether or not I was real? Or, is your energy really running so low that you can't? She asked. Sasuke finally replied by driving his knee upwards into her chin. The strike forced her to let go of his front, thus allowing him to escape. She can feel it. She knows I'm getting tired. I can't keep this up forever. Not like this, he thought frantically as Gaara calmly advanced towards him with a confident, maddened grin on her face. Coming to a decision within himself, Sasuke weaved a few seals, lowered himself down onto one knee, and gripped his left wrist as tightly as he could. No choice now. I've gotta put her off pressuring me, he vowed. Through a grunt of effort, a blue and white mass of electrical chakra began to crackle and flash in the palm of his left hand. Once it had reached a certain level of density and intensity, the Leaf Genin turned his stance directly towards Gaara. Chidori, he bellowed. The redhead could do nothing but make a brief face of confusion as Sasuke barreled across the arena towards her on a linear path of destruction. During his final step, Sasuke thrust his electrically charged arm out in front of him and rammed the jutsu straight through Gaara's right shoulder. The crowd, which had been chanting and cheering a moment earlier, fell silent. The only sounds that could be heard were the wails of Sasuke's jutsu and the ragged breathing of both he and Gaara. The Jinchuriki and the Uchiha locked eyes as he retracted his arm from within her shoulder. Once he was free from her wound, Sasuke stumbled back and waited for his efforts to bear fruit, which they did. Gaara dropped to her knees and coughed painfully, sending a grotesque amount of blood down into a puddle in front of her. She gripped her shoulder and struggled to prevent hyperventilation while her mouth dripped blood. Despite all of the horrific symptoms caused by the impalement, the redhead was still very much alive. Critically injured, but alive all the same. She's not human. That should have been it. Sasuke marveled as Gaara forced her way back to a semi-standing position. The Uchiha then drew a kunai and took steps to reach her in order to finish the job he had started. See careful N now. Walking in unguarded is still a poor idea, Gaara rasped. At her words, all of the sand scattered throughout the arena came rushing in towards the pair of genin. Sasuke's eyes widened in shock. He was too drained to avoid so much sand all at once. Fortunately for him, none of the sand touched him. Instead, it weaved around his body and swirled in a circle around its controller, slowly but surely building up a dome-like shell. Unable to stop whatever was occurring, the Uchiha simply looked on in awe as Gaara disappeared from view behind a structure of sand. Once all of the sand had gathered and shaped itself, there was stillness. Though stagnant, the arena was not silent. Indeed, there was a detectable sound one could hear should they focus their senses. From within the shell of sand, a low, dark growl could be heard. Kankuro shuddered at the all-too-familiar sight. Any semblance of calm he had been clinging to vanished in an instant. There was no stability now. The moment Sasuke had impaled Gaara, the fragile illusion of peace had been shattered. The redhead's composure had snapped in two, and chaos was bound to ensue within several minutes. Taking a glance at Temari, who stood to his left, the puppeteer pursed his lips. Should we get this whole thing over with? He asked quietly. The fan wielder kept her eyes glued on the sand shell down below and shook her head firmly. No, not quite yet. We need to see how this plays out first. There aren't any guarantees yet, she said. Kankuro sighed and looked to Sasuke sympathetically. He's as good as dead, Tamari. If Gaara is doing what I think she is, he won't survive. Nobody's ever seen that form and come out alive, he reminded his sister. A surge of chakra then washed over the stadium, eliciting a collective gasp of confusion from the crowd. Despite their past experiences, neither sibling could suppress the icy feeling that was creeping into their subconscious. They knew what was coming, but they were unprepared all the same. How long until the shell breaks? Kankuro asked. Tamari studied the state of the sand dome that hid her sister from view carefully. Probably a minute or two. Attacking it is pointless, and Sasuke seems aware. The real question is how long he lasts once Gaara is finished, she replied. Kankuro shifted uncomfortably at the thought. What's your guess on that? He asked. Temari's response was fairly instant given the potential nuance of his question, which made it all the more bleak. Not long. Maybe 5 minutes if he tries to stay away from her for the most part. 2 if he's feeling brave, she said bluntly. Before the puppeteer could respond, a deafening roar tore into the eardrums of all the attendees. Tamari clenched her jaw and covered her ears. I think she's done, she said matter-of-factly. Her words would prove prescient, as the outer layers of Gaara's shell soon began to crack and split. Bit by bit, the dome withered away into dust. Soon enough, small holes had formed in the barrier, allowing a window into the structure. The darkness within the shell still sheltered the more specific details of the girl it contained, but her outline could now be made out with relative ease. Even just a glimpse of what their sister had become was enough to freeze the blood of Kankuro and Tamari in their veins. The darkest of memories were flooding back into their minds with the same fear attached. Although it had been several years since the redhead had transformed in such a way, it felt as though no time at all had passed. Then, as if in scorn of the siblings' discomfort, the shell shattered completely. Sasuke swallowed nervously as his foe stood menacingly before him in a shower of shimmering sand. It was quite a sight, to say the least. In terms of shape, Gaara was more or less unchanged. She was still diminutive, and her posture was upright with an air of silent smugness to it, but the specific details of her appearance had been massively overhauled. Her right arm, which had been severely injured by Sasuke's most recent jutsu, was encased in a form-fitting armor of sand that reached the base of her neck on the same side. The sand was also covered in a pattern of tattoos that reached up onto the redhead's face, covering most of her right cheek and seeming to feed into her eye on the same side. There was an odd asymmetry to her appearance post-transformation. One arm was armored while the other was bare, and only half of her face was tattooed. The only consistency was her eyes, which both possessed a deep, golden iris with a diamond-shaped pupil. After a lengthy silence, Sasuke spoke. With all that noise you were making, I figured you'd grow an inch or two, he joked, his grip tightening around the kunai he was holding as he spoke. Gaara grinned and chuckled a bit, revealing a pair of fangs within her mouth. I think you'll find that my size is less a burden and more a boon, she assured him. Sasuke was not afforded the chance to answer. In a maneuver reminiscent of the countless he himself had performed, Gaara suddenly disappeared from sight in a blinding display of speed. The location of her reappearance was unknown to the Uchiha until he was tapped on the shoulder. As he whirled around to face his adversary, however, he was nailed on the side of his chin with a punch from the redhead's armored right hand. He kept himself from falling over, but he was still sent stumbling away by the forceful blow. What the hell was that? She was stuck in the mud a minute ago, he thought frantically as Gaara casually strolled towards him with her hands at her waist. Sensing his shock with ease, the Jinchuriki once again closed him down with alarming speed. This time, she seized his wrist and clamped down on it. You were quite confident in your speed only a few minutes ago. Where's that swagger gone, she asked, spinning around behind him and twisting his arm against his back as she mocked him. The leaf genin grimaced and struggled against her grip, but found it to be ironclad. As his shoulder joint was strained, the pain increased exponentially. Well aware that his arm would snap if Gaara increased her pressure any more, Sasuke whipped his head back as hard as he could. The back of his skull slammed into the redhead's cheekbone and loosened her grip just enough for the Uchiha to spin away and separate from her. Sasuke then charged back into the line of fire with another pair of kunai drawn. Gaara, whose cheek was now bruised a black and blue color, rushed forward to meet his aggression in kind. The pair clashed together with a surprising spray of sparks. Sasuke's set of blades had slashed across Gaara's armored limb, but the metal kunai had been repelled. That sand is harder than steel. Just great, the Leaf Genin lamented as he leaned back to avoid a swing of her arm. As Gaara overextended from her lack of connection, Sasuke snapped back at her with a stinging counter to the right side of her jawline. Despite landing flush, the strike had no effect on the demonic girl aside from momentarily turning her head to the side. When he retracted his punch, Sasuke winced. Her skin felt like metal. Unfortunately, the lapse in concentration would cost him, as Gaara hadn't been stunned in the slightest. She took advantage of his lowered defenses by landing a harsh, right-handed punch to his unprotected stomach. The blow practically folded Sasuke in half at the waist as he dropped to his knees. Gaara's assault was then viciously concluded by a swift kick to his downcast face that sent him tumbling away. By now, the crowd had grown silent as their native son was battered. The turnaround had been so stark and sudden that they had likely been shocked into their lack of chatter. It seems they've given up on you, Sasuke. How disloyal of them, Gaara jeered in reference to said crowd. The Uchiha groaned and rolled onto his hands and knees. She's not even using her sand and she's kicking me around. She's too fast for my eyes to track, and she hits harder than me. What happened to her? He pondered through his pain. It took him all of 15 seconds to find the obvious answer. Odd. You're weaker than Rock Lee was at his height, and yet I still feel the need to draw on my secondary reserves. Why am I always the one who gets the unfair matchups? First Haku, then Orochimaru, and now a Jinchuriki, he silently complained. A sigh then escaped his lips as he stood to his feet to continue fighting. Then again, I think Sensei mentioned it a few times during training, he admitted. He then quickly formulated a plan within his mind. Reaching into the supply pack strapped to his left leg, Sasuke produced a line of wire and drew it out a foot. Then, he ran at his highest possible speed towards his foe. Gaara took the bait. She swung her sand-clad arm at his head as he approached, which Sasuke proactively ducked underneath. Once he was past her, the Uchiha pivoted around Gaara and leapt back to the place from which he had started. When the redhead moved to pursue him, she found that she was ensnared in a tangle of wire. Sasuke then bit down on the end of the wire and performed a series of hand seals. Fire style. Dragon flame jutsu. He yelled through clenched teeth. A stream of flames then cascaded down the wire and engulfed the Jinchuriki entirely. Despite the flames ravaging her body, Gaara stalked forward relentlessly. Somehow, she was still unfazed. Realizing that continuing the jutsu would be perilous, Sasuke released the wire from his mouth and stopped the stream of flames. He then leapt upwards onto the wall to his back, taking his eyes off of Gaara for a split second. The moment his feet touched the side of the arena, he was seized by the neck. The demonic girl had jumped up after him during his moment of minuscule distraction. Using her grip to rip him off the wall, Gaara allowed gravity to take both she and the Uchiha down towards the ground below. Sasuke was promptly slammed into the dirt by his throat. On top of this, Gaara had also used him as a landing pad, with her knee driving into his solar plexus. Blood flew from the Leaf Genin's mouth as the Jinchuriki cruelly squeezed his windpipe and pressed her shockingly significant weight down on his chest. I figured you'd be able to make me work a little harder than this, but alas. I suppose I shouldn't have expected much more than a dying gasp after you expended so much chakra trying to punch a hole in me, Gaara said as she slowly drained the life out of her unfortunate victim. Sasuke bared his teeth and tried to forcibly sit up, but found himself physically outmatched. Don't bother struggling. You're weaker than I am by orders of magnitude, she said as she tried to crush his throat. Emptying most of what remained of his reserves, Sasuke gripped her wrist and injected a surge of electrical chakra into her body. The pulse knocked Gaara off of him and gave him the space to raggedly scramble to his feet. The redhead, who was seated on her rear end, growled and rose to meet him. Her body was occasionally twitching from the shock, and her face was the picture of irritation. "Why won't you just roll over?" she hissed. The Uchiha wiped blood from the corner of his mouth and settled in a fragile taijutsu stance. "Because it clearly bothers you," he said with a weak smile. Gaara momentarily looked ready to scream at him, but opted to take a deep breath instead. Once she had cycled through her oxygen several times, her expression smoothed out. "I'm not even here for you, and yet you've made me want to kill you. Congratulations. You've signed your own death certificate," she said eerily. Sasuke frowned. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "Not here for me. I've been your opponent from day one," he questioned. Gaara glanced up into a certain sector of the crowd briefly, seemingly searching for something. Once she was apparently satisfied, she returned her glare to the Uchiha. "Oh, you'll learn soon enough." "Well, actually, you won't. You'll die before you find out," she vowed. She promptly charged forward with renewed fury with Sasuke in her sights. The Leaf Genin scowled defiantly and drew a kunai. From there, a beating ensued. The Chunin exams had seen one-sided spectacles before. They were fairly commonplace, if anything. Every single year, two combatants were matched together whose skill sets simply favored one genin far more than the other. Despite the commonality of such contests, what was occurring at present was extreme by any standard. Sasuke, for all the success he had been having not too long ago, was being comprehensively thrashed. It was hardly a fight anymore. Every tactic he tried, he was punished for. Every wayward strike he landed was shrugged off. He was completely outclassed. More depressing than the simple reality of his slim chances, however, was the fact that he was still the far more skilled combatant of the two. Every time Gaara attacked him, he would lace her with a counter and attempt to pivot around her to end the exchange right then and there. The issue was that the redhead could afford to simply absorb the punishment and follow him as he retreated. Coupled with her blistering speed, Gaara's aggression was Sasuke's undoing. "This is going nowhere. She'll kill him if he stops being defensive. He's fighting to survive," Kakashi, who continued to watch despite the savagery, thought to himself. Gaara then brutally knocked Sasuke down, drawing a flinch from the Jonin. "You don't have to keep watching, you know." The silver-haired ninja turned and glanced behind him, spotting Guy approaching him from the leftmost entrance of his seating section. "I owe it to him to at least watch. He deserves that respect," Kakashi said solemnly. Guy took a seat beside him and studied the hopeless battle. "For as badly as he's losing, your boy is clearly well drilled. He's doing the right things, but this Gaara is far too much for him physically," he commented. Kakashi sighed and shook his head. "I should have expected that. I knew she was a Jinchuriki, and I still ignored the possibility that she had a transformation in her back pocket," he said ashamedly. Guy put a hand on his shoulder. "There was nothing you could have done to prepare him. This is a matter of strength, not preparation. Frustrating as it is, Sasuke simply isn't strong enough. And we shouldn't expect him to be. He's battling a tailed beast," he assured his comrade. Kakashi nodded and pursed his lips underneath his mask. "Now that I think about it, Naruto would have had a much better chance against her, even as she is now. Unlike Sasuke, he has the raw power to contend with her when backed into a corner," he said thoughtfully. Guy chuckled. "As much as it pains me to admit it, Sasuke likely would have beaten Neji as well. The matchups would have been thematic, if you think about it. Sasuke and Neji both wield dojutsu, and Naruto is a Jinchuriki like Gaara," he commented. Kakashi cast him a sideways glance. "Oh, so you know about Naruto's status?" he asked. Guy shrugged and rested his face against his fist. "I've known for quite some time. His birthday and ostracization made it an easy riddle to solve." "Does he know?" he asked. "He found out the day of his graduation. Not in the gentlest way, but such is life, I guess. He first used the power in earnest against a hunter named Haku," the silver-haired ninja explained. Before Guy could reply, something strange happened. The stadium went entirely silent. The crowd had been fairly quiet for the past several minutes, but chatter had still been audible. Now, there was no sound whatsoever. A brief scanning of the area revealed another oddity. The vast majority of the crowd was unconscious. Sasuke spit blood out of his mouth and grit his teeth. His entire body was in pain. From the bruises on his face to the weakness in his knees, he was battered. In stark contrast to his weariness was Gaara, who stood unscathed and unimpeded. If anything, she looked pleased with the situation. She was winning, after all. You could have simply given up by now, but here you are, trying your hardest. I'm not sure whether to be impressed by your grit or to pity your idiocy, Gaara said as she walked him down. Sasuke growled and stepped forward to punch her across the jaw. Would you just shut up? He demanded as his fist approached her face. The redhead easily caught his wrist and yanked him forward into a headbutt. The blunt force buckled the Uchiha and sent him down to his knees. Not yet satisfied, the demonic girl seized him by his hair and ripped him from the ground to dangle before her. I've knocked you down a dozen different ways by now, and yet you still make the same mistakes. You really are a glutton for punishment, she said jabbingly. Expecting to be struck once again, Sasuke braced himself for the impact. Surprisingly, though, no such punch, kick, or knee came. Instead of damaging him further, Gaara was now staring into the crowd carefully. Opting to follow her lead, the Leaf Genin turned his attention to the attendees. What he saw was eerie and unsettling. The mass of people, seemingly each and every one of them, were all asleep. Their heads were leaned off on one another's shoulders, their belongings had been dropped from their hands, and they made no sounds. So, it's begun, Gaara muttered to herself. She then returned her focus to Sasuke, who was wide-eyed and puzzled. Count yourself lucky. Any other day, you'd be dead. Right now, though, I have bigger fish to fry, she said vaguely before letting go of his hair and dropping him to the ground. Sasuke caught himself as he hit the dirt and tried to stand, but found that his legs had no strength left in them. Where the hell are you going? He demanded as Gaara walked away from him with her back turned. The Jinchuriki paid him no heed. She simply kept on walking. Mustering the last of his energy, Sasuke exploded to his feet to chase after her. Unfortunately, he tripped over himself before he could even take 10 steps. Despite his failure to close the gap, his effort did earn him acknowledgement. You remind me more of Naruto than I thought you would. That tenacity is admirable, if a tad stupid in your position. Still, though, stay down. I'm throwing you a lifeline. I suggest you take it, Gaara said before disappearing up the stairwell she had been approaching. Frustrated, bloodied, and beaten, Sasuke sighed heavily and laid flat on his stomach with his head turned to the side. Exhausted as his body was, his mind still remained active. The final words Gaara had uttered to him before leaving him to lament his defeat had created a question in